The morning felt ordinary mist over the hedgerows, the slow hush of country lanes until a bullet-fast Range Rover tore through it. In one breath, routine became crisis. A distracted young driver, a royal car beginning to pull out, and a single sergeant who hurled his body between metal and life. What happens in the instant between instinct and impact? This is a story of a split-second decision that changed everything: courage, consequence, and the fragile truth that followed. If this kind of close-call human story grabs you, like and subscribe. We dig into the moments where ordinary people do extraordinary things. Share this with someone who believes honesty still matters. Ready to hear the full, unfiltered story. The road curling past Gatcombe Park is usually the kind of place where time strolls instead of moves. Early mornings drift in quietly there. Soft light on wet grass, the slow hum of a distant tractor. The calm routine of a royal protection officer checking mirrors before pulling out of the estate. Nothing about that hour suggested danger. Nothing hinted that within seconds, an entire chain of lives would collide in the most literal sense. Sergeant James Crawford had done this route hundreds of times. He wasn't a man given to theatrics or self-importance. He was the kind who knew the weight of silence, who understood why a guard's job wasn't to be seen, only to be ready. And that morning, he was ready in ways he didn't yet understand. Princess Anne was scheduled for a quiet departure, no cameras, no press, just a short drive toward a waiting helicopter. She sat in the back seat, reading over a briefing sheet, unaware of anything unusual. The driver signaled eased forward, and the car began rolling toward the junction connecting the private road to the lane outside. At that exact moment, just around the bend, a black Range Rover shot into view. Driven by Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, the SUV was in T, creeping or cautious. Witnesses later said it was moving like a slingshot, far above what anyone expected on that narrow patch of countryside. And the truth was painfully simple. He never saw the royal vehicle inching out, not until it was too late. Sergeant Crawford saw it first, not the car, the danger, the momentum, the angle. He registered it with the terrifying clarity that comes only when instincts outrun thought. One fraction of a second, one inhale, and he moved. He didn't shout, he didn't wait, he sprinted. You know those moments in life where the body decides before the mind can argue? This was that moment amplified. Crawford lunged between the two vehicles, slamming his palms against the hood of the royal car, forcing the driver to brake so hard the seatbelt snapped tight across chests inside. There was barely enough room for the guard's boots to skid across the wet ground. Just behind him, the SUV locked its brakes, tires screaming, the road ripping under them. Metal shrieked, rubber burned. Time for everyone watching, split in two. The collision wasn't catastrophic thanks to Crawford's intervention, but it was violent enough. The Range Rover clipped him and half-spun before crashing into a ditch. The guard's legs folded underneath him as he hit the road, thrown like a rag doll across the gravel. Princess Anne's door flew open before any protocol officer could stop her. She was by his side in seconds, steady, focused. Refusing to panic while officers scrambled around the smashed vehicles, radios crackling like angry hornets. Crawford was conscious. Barely he managed a single, slurred line, "Ma'am, you're safe." Those who were there say she squeezed his hand, and for a brief moment, all titles dropped away. It wasn't a princess and a royal guard, it was one human holding on to another who had just saved her life. Emergency cruise. Arrived fast. Word travels even faster when royalty is involved. Tom Parker Bowles, shaken and pale, climbed out from the crashed SUV. He wasn't injured, but shock clung to him like frost. He apologized repeatedly to officers, to paramedics, to anyone who would listen, but the apologizing didn't slow the cameras that would soon find their way there or the narrative already forming in the public's mind, because stories like this never stay quiet. Within hours, the press picked it up. A royal guard critically injured. Camilla struck. Camilla's son behind the wheel. 3 ingredients that ignite a firestorm. Crawford was taken to hospital with severe injuries to his pelvis and leg, a fractured rib, bruising across half his torso. But he was alive, and every doctor who saw the scans knew exactly why. If the SUV had hit the royal car instead of him, the outcome could have been devastating. Meanwhile, the public conversation grew louder.
Very loud.
People asked hard questions. Why was Tom Parker Bowles speeding? Was he distracted? Would he face charges? Would his connection to the royal family influence the investigation? These were the kind of questions no palace ever wants to hear echoing across the evening news. But the police investigation stayed firm, independent, unusually transparent. And slowly, the pieces came together. Witness statements, CCTV footage from a farm gate, skid mark analysis, phone records, everything. The conclusion: he was speeding massively, misjudged the bend. He reacted too slowly. And while the collision wasn't intentional, his driving had directly caused a man's serious injuries. The case went to court. It wasn't a sensational trial, but it didn't need to be. Public interest was already sky high. Tom Parker Bowles walked into the courtroom looking like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. The press cameras snapped like locusts. And inside, his barristers didn't argue the impossible. He pleaded guilty.
There was no privilege, no hidden corridor of influence. Not this time. He was sentenced to 3 months in prison and banned from driving for a year. Even so, the story didn't end there. Because what shocked the public wasn't the sentence. It was who showed up at the hospital weeks later. Princess Anne. She arrived quietly, without an entourage, to see the guard who would save her life. She sat with him and his family, speaking softly, asking about his recovery, thanking him with the kind of sincerity you cannot fake. You could call it duty, but to those in the room, it felt personal, the kind of gratitude that settles deep in the chest. Crawford, still stiff with metal pins in his leg, tried to joke about it. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he whispered through the oxygen tube. And she replied, "You did far more than that." There's a certain irony in how history remembers events like this. A crash, a trial, a punishment. Those parts are factual, documented. But the human moments are what stay with people. The quiet visit, the fractured guard, the princess holding his hand, the son of the queen consort facing consequences, the split-second choice that could have rewritten royal history if it had gone the other way. By the time Crawford returned to light duty months later, the public had made up its mind. He was a hero, not the headline kind, not the chest-thumping sort, but the kind who runs toward danger because someone else might get hurt if he doesn't. And maybe that's why this story still lingers. Because for all the grandeur of palaces and titles, for all the ceremony and tradition, it only took one ordinary man's instinct to remind the world that even royalty depends on the courage of people who will never sit on a throne. There was no privilege, no hidden corridor of influence. Not this time. He was sentenced to 3 months in prison and banned from driving for a year. Even so, the story didn't end there. Because what shocked the public wasn't the sentence. It was who showed up at the hospital weeks later. Princess Anne. She arrived quietly, without an entourage, to see the guard who would save her life. She sat with him and his family, speaking softly, asking about his recovery, thanking him with the kind of sincerity you cannot fake. You could call it duty, but to those in the room, it felt personal, the kind of gratitude that settles deep in the chest. Crawford, still stiff with metal pins in his leg, tried to joke about it. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he whispered through the oxygen tube. And she replied, "You did far more than that." There's a certain irony in how history remembers events like this. A crash, a trial, a punishment. Those parts are factual, documented. But the human moments are what stay with people. The quiet visit, the fractured guard, the princess holding his hand, the son of the queen consort facing consequences, the split-second choice that could have rewritten royal history if it had gone the other way. By the time Crawford returned to light duty months later, the public had made up its mind. He was a hero, not the headline kind, not the chest-thumping sort, but the kind who runs toward danger because someone else might get hurt if he doesn't. And maybe that's why this story still lingers. Because for all the grandeur of palaces and titles, for all the ceremony and tradition, it only took one ordinary man's instinct to remind the world that even royalty depends on the courage of people who will never sit on a throne. The weeks after the crash carried a strange kind of silence, the kind that hangs over a place after a storm passes, leaving debris behind, but no clear explanation of why everything suddenly feels different. Gatcombe Park, usually so peaceful, now felt like a place where everyone moved a little slower, spoke a little softer, and watched the road longer than before. Even the staff admitted it. The crash had unsettled the estate in a way no protocol manual could fix. Princessin wasn't the type to dramatize anything. If anything, she was known for her brisk efficiency, that let's get on with it attitude the public admired. But those who worked closest to her swore that, for days after crash, she kept replaying the moment in her mind. The screech, the jolt, the sight of her guard collapsing in front of her. She didn't cry. She wasn't wired that way. But something had tightened inside her, a kind of quiet awareness of just how close everything had come to unraveling. Sergeant James Crawford's absence was a hole the size of a person, not a position. His desk sat untouched. His boots were left exactly where he placed them. And in the oddest way, his injury became the heartbeat of the estate. Everyone asked about him. Everyone waited for updates. Even the gardeners whispered his name as if afraid to break something fragile in the air. But outside, beyond the hedgerows and the quiet routine of royal life, the world was roaring. The son of the queen consort injures a royal guard. Princessin narrowly avoids disaster. Was this negligence or something more? The headlines didn't soften. They didn't slow. And they didn't miss a single opportunity to provoke outrage. You could almost feel the tension brewing between the modern monarchy and the public's endless appetite for accountability. It wasn't just a crash anymore. It had become a symbol of privilege, a symbol of responsibility, a symbol of how quickly public opinion can swing from admiration to anger. And right in the center of the storm was Tom Parker Bowles. He hadn't intended harm. Everyone knew that, but intent doesn't erase consequences. The footage of him walking into the police station voluntarily, shoulders hunched, eyes down, became one of the most replayed clips on British television that month. People analyzed his expression the way art critics analyze brushstrokes. Was he remorseful enough? Was he being treated like any other citizen? Would the courts go easy because of who his mother was? The tension was palpable, and every legal expert on TV repeated the same warning. The public will not tolerate special treatment in this case. Meanwhile, Sergeant Crawford's recovery became something of a national concern. Messages poured in, handwritten letters from school children, folded cards from military veterans, even small sketches made by people who wanted to honor a man they had never met. Some were simple. Thank you for your service. Others carried the weight of unspoken fears. My brother is a police officer. You saved someone. I hope someone save him if he ever needs it. Crawford read these from his hospital bed, propped up by pillows, tubes snaking across his body like pale vines. He was never one for attention, but even he couldn't deny what he felt, gratitude, and perhaps a faint sense of disbelief. Heroes don't usually see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as people who did what needed to be done. But sometimes the world insists on the title anyway. When Princessin visited him, quietly, without press or ceremony, Crawford's wife later said it was the only time he let emotion break through his controlled exterior. Not tears, but a kind of softness, a crack in the armor. Because royalty isn't expected to appear in hospital rooms like ordinary relatives. And yet there she was, holding his hand, talking to him as if they were equals connected by something heavier than duty. Meanwhile, the courts prepared. The trial was scheduled quickly, intentionally, to avoid the appearance of delays or special treatment. Police statements were finalized. Impact reports were written. The Crown Prosecution Service made its evaluations, and barristers on both sides rehearsed arguments that balanced law, public expectation, and the uncomfortable reality that the defendant was connected to the very institution intertwined with the victim. When the day arrived, the courthouse buzzed like an overturned hive. Reporters lined the pavement. Satellite trucks blocked traffic. Commentators positioned themselves dramatically, eyes fixed on the entrance. Tom Parker Bowles stepped out of the car, looking nothing like the confident food critic the public knew. He looked like a man walking toward a reckoning. His suit hung a little loose. His face was drawn. And for the first time, cameras didn't treat him like a celebrity. They treated him like a defendant. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. There were no flashing lights, no chaos, just wood, stone, and the kind of cold order that makes every person sitting there feel the weight of the law. The evidence was clear. The speed analysis was damning, and Crawford's injuries were severe enough to silence any attempt at minimization. The judge didn't deliver a dramatic speech. British courts rarely do, but his words carried precision, like a scalpel cutting straight to the truth. He acknowledged remorse, intent, and cooperation. He acknowledged the seriousness of the injuries. Then he delivered a verdict that landed with the weight of a history lesson. 3 months in prison. Driving disqualification for 1 year. Some gasped, some nodded, some thought it was too lenient. Others thought it was oddly fair. But one thing was certain. The public felt something they rarely feel in cases involving people close to the crown. A sense of equality. Because the law, for once, didn't bend. But the real story wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the aftermath. When Tom Parker Bowles visited Sergeant Crawford after sentencing, quietly, without cameras or advisors, something unexpected happened. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but a moment of human truth. Crawford listened as Tom apologized. Not the polished statement kind of apology, but a raw one, messy, halting, honest. And then Crawford did something no one expected. He told him he didn't hate him. He didn't want his family dragged through the mud. He didn't want this moment to become a weapon used against the monarchy or the public or anyone in between. He just wanted people to slow down. 3 words. Simple, almost painfully so, but they carried the clarity of someone who had felt the crush of metal and the fragility of life in the same breath. In the months that followed, the story lost its sensational edge, but it didn't fade. It transformed, from anger to reflection, from blame to accountability. From a scandal to a lesson. Crawford recovered. He returned to duty. Slower at first, steadier, more deliberate, but still the same man who ran toward danger without hesitation. Princess checked on him regularly, in that subtle, unpretentious way that made the public admire her all over again. And the monarchy learned something too, not in a dramatic public statement, but in the quiet adjustments made behind walls the world never sees. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the moments no one planned. The crash, the rescue, the trial, the human honesty that followed. A reminder that titles don't shield anyone from consequence, and heroism doesn't always wear medals. In the days after sentencing, something shifted inside the royal household. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the subtle ways people move when a shock has passed yet the echo still lingers. Staff spoke in softer voices. Doors were closed more gently. And Princess N, who had always carried herself with the steadiness of an oak tree, seemed a little more reflective, as though the crash had planted a quiet storm inside her that hadn't entirely settled. The senior royals, though out of sight, were far from passive observers. Incidents like this ripple upward, pressing against the delicate machinery of the monarchy, where public duty collides with private grief, and every consequence becomes a question of what it means to the crown's relationship with the people it serves. Behind the polish were the Buckingham Palace meeting rooms. Conversations unfolded with the tension of a chess match. King Charles, who had always prided himself on fairness, struggled with a strain few could see. Tom was Camilla's son, not a royal by title, but family by blood and heart. And now, he was at the center of a story that the tabloids had no intention of letting go. Some headlines bordered on cruelty. Others demanded Charles personally intervene, as if monarchy were a switch he could flip between emotion and justice. But Charles didn't intervene. He couldn't. He knew that. And privately, it hurt him more than anyone realized. Camilla, meanwhile, carried the weight differently. She was fiercely protective of her children, a trait the public often misinterpreted as detachment from royal life. In truth, she worried endlessly. She read every article, every comment, every speculation. She stayed up late pacing halls lined with portraits of kings and queens whose troubles rarely resembled those of a modern stepmother whose son had made a terrible mistake. She visited Tom in prison quietly, without the world knowing. Witnesses described the meeting as somber but loving, a mother trying to be strong while shielding her son from a storm no one could fully shield him from. She left with swollen eyes and a silence that followed her through the palace like a shadow. But even as the royal family navigated their private turmoil, the outside world continued to process the event in its own unpredictable way. Some people felt a renewed respect for Princess, and not because she was nearly injured, but because of how she carried herself afterward. No theatrics, no public outcry, just the dignity of a woman who understood both privilege and responsibility, and who treated the guard who saved her with genuine humanity rather than ceremonial gratitude. Others saw the trial as a rare moment of balance in a society obsessed with hierarchy, a moment where the justice system proved it could hold everyone, even those connected to the crown, to the same standard. Yet there was another conversation happening, one quieter, deeper, threaded through podcasts, late-night radio, newspaper columns written by people who rarely ventured into royal discussions. They talked about Sergeant James Crawford, his decision, his instinct, his sacrifice. Who protects the protectors? What happens when duty demands a price most people can't imagine paying? Even members of the military community joined the debate, calling him a guardian in the truest sense. Some civilian groups even petitioned for formal recognition, and though medals require layers of protocol and approval, the sentiment rippled deeply through the institutions tasked with granting them. Meanwhile, Crawford continued his recovery with a kind of quiet resilience that impressed everyone around him. He hated fuss, and he particularly hated being called a hero. The word made him uncomfortable, like an oversized jacket he hadn't grown into. But one afternoon, a gray, drizzly October day, a small, unexpected moment shifted everything. Princess returned to visit him again. This time, she didn't come with formalities or polite smiles. She came with something else, something personal. She brought letters from staff at Gatcombe Park who had asked if she would deliver them, but she also brought one small, handwritten note of her own. Crawford's wife later said he read it 3 times. It wasn't long. It wasn't poetic. It didn't need to be. It simply said, "You protected my life. I hope we, in return, protect yours." It was the kind of sentence that carried a lifetime of meaning in a handful of words. And in that moment, Crawford realized something. The crash hadn't just changed his life. It changed the entire dynamic of trust between him and the woman he protected. Duty had evolved into something deeper, something rare. But the palace, for all its composure, wasn't free from tension. Some advisors quietly worried about the optics. Should the monarchy distance itself from Tom? Should they speak publicly? Should they reinforce the narrative of equality before the law? Others pushed for silence. Let the courts speak for themselves, they argued. And in an odd twist, silence became the loudest message of all. Because the monarchy did not shield Tom. They did not soften consequences. They did not use influence. In a world where powerful families often bend systems to their will, choosing not to intervene became the most powerful statement they could make. The public noticed. And surprisingly, many respected it. Meanwhile, Tom, serving his sentence quietly, reflected on the crash in a way that humbled even those who had initially condemned him. He wrote to Crawford several times, letters that the guard read but never publicly acknowledged. Some were apologies. Others were reflections. One was simply gratitude that Crawford was alive. There was no expectation of forgiveness, no request for it, just a man confronting the reality of what his mistake had cost. But life moves on, even when the past clings to the edges of it. By winter, Crawford was walking again, stiffly, carefully, but walking. His youngest daughter held his hand during physio sessions, cheering every step, while his wife became the steady lighthouse in their stormy months. And slowly, the royal family's world began to stabilize. Princess resumed full duties, though she checked in regularly with the protection team in ways she hadn't before. Not out of fear, but awareness. Camilla returned to public engagements, her smile softer, her demeanor more subdued, as if carrying invisible weight. King Charles focused on a message the public seemed to appreciate: fairness, accountability, and a reminder that monarchy isn't invincibility, it's responsibility. And yet, beneath all of this, there was one question people kept asking. Would Sergeant Crawford receive formal recognition for his actions? The palace stayed silent. Not dismissive, just careful, because honors carry significance, tradition, and the need for measured decision-making. But behind closed doors, one thing had already been decided. What Crawford did that day would never be forgotten. Not by the palace, not by Princess, and certainly not by the man whose speeding SUV changed both their lives. Sometimes the greatest impact of a single moment is not the headlines it creates, but the quiet truths it forces everyone to face. Winter settled over the countryside like a soft blanket, turning the fields around Gatcombe Park pale and still. The world had calmed since the storm of headlines, but the echoes of the crash never fully disappeared. They lingered, in the way people slowed at bends in the road, in the way royal security protocols were reviewed with fresh urgency, and in the way Princess, and occasionally paused before stepping into a car, just long enough for a guard to notice. Time had passed, yes, but it hadn't erased anything. It had only clarified what mattered. Sergeant James Crawford was slowly returning to himself. Physically, the progress was steady, metal pins removed, strength rebuilt, walking sticks slowly abandoned. But emotionally, recovery was more complicated. A close brush with death leaves threads inside a person that take longer to untangle. He didn't dwell on the what-ifs. That wasn't his style. Instead, he focused on what had happened, the choice he made, the life he protected, and the responsibility he still felt each time he looked at the royal crest stitched onto his uniform. One morning, during an appointment, his doctor, a kind man with a soft voice, asked him something simple. Do you ever think about why you moved? Why you ran toward danger instead of away from it? Crawford paused, searching for words. Because she trusted me, he finally said. And trust isn't something you freeze on. It was the clearest explanation he had ever given. Outside the hospital room, Princess Anne's private secretary waited, not to rush him, but to deliver requests, the kind of requests that carried the quiet weight of royal sincerity. The princess would like you to join her for tea at the estate, the secretary said. Crawford blinked. Tea? Yes. The man replied with a small smile. Tea. And so he went. The moment he stepped into the sitting room, Princess Anne stood. Something she didn't do for just anyone. She greeted him warmly, with a softness that hinted at just how deeply the incident had touched her. They talked about his recovery, about his family, about protocol and training. But eventually, the conversation slipped into a space so personal it surprised them both. You changed the course of my life, she said quietly. Not just by saving it, but by reminding me how much your duty costs. Crawford didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent, which somehow felt truer. Then she handed him a small envelope, unassuming, cream-colored, sealed with her personal insignia. For later, she said, almost shyly. He didn't open it until he was home. Inside was a note, handwritten, carefully pressed, and far more intimate than anything he expected. There are acts of duty, and there are acts of courage. What you did was both. And beneath it was something else, a private commendation letter addressed to the Royal Victorian Order Committee. He stared at it for a long time, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to emotion. Medals weren't guaranteed. They weren't automatic. They were chosen, recommended, signed, approved. This letter was a first step. But life, as it tends to do, continued moving even while official wheels turned slowly. Spring brought a new shift, not in the palace, but in the public. Interest in the crash had narrowed down to something far more meaningful, a fascination with the people involved rather than the scandal itself. A documentary crew reached out to Crawford, asking if he would speak. He declined. He wasn't interested in attention. He didn't want spotlights. But he didn't object when others spoke about him. Colleagues, officers, witnesses. Their accounts painted him not as a legend, but as a professional who had simply done the right thing. And oddly, that humility made the story resonate even more. Everyday heroism, the media called it. A rare moment when instinct and duty aligned perfectly. A reminder that courage still lives in the most ordinary places. But while the public conversation found a hopeful tone, the royal household faced one more complicated chapter. Tom Parker Bowles was released from prison quietly. No cameras, no statements, no grand gestures. Just a man stepping into daylight with lessons carved deep into him. His family supported him privately, tenderly, away from judgmental eyes. He didn't attempt to repair his public image. He accepted what had happened, and with surprising sensitivity, he asked if he could meet Crawford again, not for publicity, not for forgiveness, but for closure. Crawford agreed. Their second conversation was short, honest, and unexpectedly grounding. Tom said, "I know I can't undo what happened, but I'm trying to be someone who doesn't waste the second chance your pain gave me." And Crawford, steady as ever, replied, "Just go slow. That's all I ask." It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but something more subtle, a recognition of two lives forever linked by one catastrophic second. By summer, the palace began preparing for a private ceremony, one that would honor key members of the royal household for their service. Not public, not televised, just royals and staff gathered in a single, dignified room. Crawford didn't expect much. He certainly didn't expect his name to be called, but it was. Princessin stepped forward, not as a princess, but as the woman whose life he had saved, and pinned a medal to his uniform herself. The room held its breath. There were no camera flashes, no journalists scribbling down notes, just genuine respect settling over every person present. Crawford's hands trembled, and leaned in slightly and whispered, "This doesn't repay you. It simply acknowledges a truth." He swallowed hard. "Thank you, ma'am." But the real honor was the way the room looked at him. Not as a guard, but as a man whose courage had reminded them what duty really means. Weeks later, as life finally returned to something resembling normal, Crawford found himself back on routine duties. Standing near entrances, checking routes, ensuring safety in the quiet, unseen ways guards always do. But now, every time Princessin stepped into a car, there was a split second where their eyes met. A tiny acknowledgement, a silent thread binding protector and protected. That moment, that tiny exchange, carried more meaning than any medal. Because history often celebrates crowns, events, scandals, and headlines. But sometimes, the moments that truly shift the legacy of a royal family are the ones that happen far from cameras. In a ditch on a country road, in the instinctive sprint of a man who refused to let fate decide the outcome. The crash may have lasted only seconds, but its consequences rippled through lives, reshaped relationships, tested principles, and revealed something powerful. Courage doesn't require royalty. Justice doesn't fear titles. And heroes don't wait for permission. They act. Sergeant Crawford never sought recognition, but quietly, irrevocably, he earned his place in royal history. Not by birth, not by privilege, but by one extraordinary choice made in the blink of an eye.